Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Hong Kong Zoom events. I'm Keith Richburg. I'm the president of the FCC. Before we get to our distinguished speaker, we've got a couple of upcoming events you might be interested in. We've got a lot of upcoming events, so please stay tuned to fcchk.org. If you have not signed up already, on July 7th, we have Jasper Zhang Weiwei. You might know him, former president of LegCo, the Legislative Council here in Hong Kong, and former head of the Democratic Alliance for Betterment of Hong Kong. He's going to be speaking about Hong Kong over the next 25 years, since we're now halfway through the 2047 promise of autonomy and freedom. And we are now able to restart our FCC Zoom events and also our FCC film nights. And so we're having films here in Hong Kong. We're having one on July 11th, which is called The Six. It's a film about the untold story of 6 Chinese survivors of the Titanic, the sinking of the Titanic. You all know about the Titanic, but you probably did not know that there were 6 Chinese survivors there. So we're going to be showing that film here on July 11th. The film is called The Six. So please sign up for that if you have not already. But tonight, we've got a really distinguished guest zooming in from Shanghai. And so I apologize if we have any technical glitches during the evening between now and Shanghai. Our guest is Professor Zhang Weiwei. He's director of the China Institute at Fudan University, a distinguished professor of international relations and director of the China Institute at Fudan University, as well as being a board member of China's National Think Tanks Council. He's worked as most importantly, a senior English interpreter for Deng Xiaoping, who we all know, and also other Chinese leaders in the mid-1980s. He's traveled to over 100 countries. He's got a Ph.D. in international relations from Geneva University. He's written extensively in Chinese and English about China's political and economic reforms, the China model of development, and China's foreign policy. And he actually predicted that the Arab Spring Revolution might become an Arab winter. So Professor Zhang is here with us today to talk about the topic of Whither democracy and Hong Kong, a civilizational state perspective. And he's going to talk to us tonight about what a civilizational state is. And he's going to give us his perspective on that. So first of all, Professor Zhang, thank you for joining us from Shanghai, from Fudan. Shanghai is one of my favorite places. I lived there for a while. So really glad to have you join us here at the FCC in Hong Kong. And before we start, how are things in Shanghai now?
Oh, it's all normal, and we go to restaurants, shops, supermarkets, normal.
Okay, fantastic.
So after a short period of a bit inconvenience, now it's all normal.
Okay.
China model works.
Okay, thank you, Zhang. And if I may call you Weiwei, that's okay.
Yes, please.
Great. Well, fantastic. Okay. I think you've got some opening remarks for us here at the Zoom talk. So please, without further ado, let's start with your opening remarks, and I'll have a few questions, and then we'll take some questions from our FCC audience here. If you've got questions, please do send them in to FCCHK. You know how to send them in to my WhatsApp or to the FCC. Yeah. But please, Professor Zhang or Weiwei.
Okay. Thank you, Keith, for your kind introduction and for your invitation to speak at the FCC on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Hong Kong handover, and to share with you my own thoughts as a scholar on this hugely important topic with democracy and Hong Kong, a civilizational state perspective. As you know, I always describe the nature of the Chinese state as a civilizational state, which means an amalgamation of world's longest continuous civilization with a super large modern state. And I myself coined the phrase civilizational state over a decade ago to distinguish it from the term then used a lot called civilization-state, used more by Western sinologists, notably American sinologist Lucien Pai. He asserted China as an ancient civilization only, yet pretending to be a modern state. my view is vastly different. I think China today is, first of all, a modern state, yet with many civilizational features. Interestingly, by now, however, the two expressions, civilizational state and civilization state, are used almost interchangeably beyond the academic world in the global mainstream political narratives. But that's fine with me. And to better understand the meaning of a civilizational state, I may draw some analogies. I would say, for instance, if the Roman Empire has lasted until now and united and transformed into a modern state, today's Europe could be a medium-sized civilizational state. Or if dozens of Islamic countries today could integrate into one unified modern state, it could also be a civilizational state of over 1 billion people. Yet all these are hypotheses only. As a civilizational state, China is a blend of old and the new, and it's an amalgamation of hundreds of states into one with its long history. And this state is bound to be unique. It has at least 4 distinguished features. 1, a super large population. 2, a super vast territory. 3, a super long tradition or super long traditions. And 4, super rich cultures. What's more important is in each of these features, there is a blend of the ancient and the modern. Let's first look at briefly China's super large population, a fact since the ancient times. China has thus an unparalleled scale of almost everything, from the scale of the market to the size of the economy and to the number of well-educated population. For instance, China now each year produces more engineers than all the Western countries combined. And this fact alone changes the world. As for China's super vast territory, which is inherited from our ancestors, but it's now covered with the world's largest and most advanced networks of bullet trains and highways, with the first-rate digital infrastructure, with 1.6 million 5G stations installed across this vast continent, accounting for nearly 70% of the world's total. Now, with regard to the super long traditions, China's traditions have evolved, developed, and adapted in virtually all branches of human knowledge and practices. For instance, the West is highly critical of China's so-called one-party system. Yet to most Chinese, it's nothing extraordinary because since its first unification in 221 BC, China has been mostly governed by a unified ruling entity. Otherwise, the country disintegrated. And China copied the American political model after the 1911 Republican Revolution. The country soon degenerated into warlords fighting each other with millions of lives lost. Furthermore, this unified ruling entity has been buttressed by a system of meritocracy, with officials selected through public exams, or what's called the Keju system China invented in the Sui dynasty close to 1,500 years ago. Now, interestingly, this ancient system has been adapted into today's what I call selection plus election. If you look at the Chinese top leadership, top echelon leadership, they have almost all served at least twice as the number one of a Chinese province, given the size of China, which means literally they've governed, administered more than 100 million people before taking up their current positions. As a result, China's top echelon leadership is obviously among the most competent in the world. Likewise, the tradition of a unified ruling entity has carried with it a holistic way of political governance for this huge and vast country. For instance, I would describe Western-style political parties as partisan interest parties, and the Chinese Communist Party as a holistic interest party. This explains why China is able to reform and reinvent itself all the time when you have a holistic interest party pioneering the way to overcome all kinds of vested interests resisting changes. As for super rich cultures, China has perhaps the richest cultural heritages, being a civilizational state. For instance, diversity in harmony is a hallmark of Chinese religious culture. In China's long history, there were very few religious wars. Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism coexisted, cross-fertilizing, which is a sharp contrast with so many religious wars throughout European history and Western history, till even today, some would say. And this deep-rooted culture of diversity and harmony has also allowed for one country, two systems to operate for Hong Kong over the past 25 years, something unthinkable, inconceivable for typical nation state. Furthermore, China's political culture tends to prioritize people's livelihood. In today's context, this means whatever the state does, political, economic, or social policies, they must all boil down to deliver tangible benefits, material or non-material, to the people. And the Chinese model values what the system delivers to the people, rather than indulging in empty rhetoric. I'm afraid it's a hallmark of many Western political systems. For instance, I remember when Obama came to power with his famous slogan, change, yet after 8 years, without much change. This is inconceivable in China. There are also two important concepts, which is Mingyi and the other is Mingxing in the Chinese political governance culture. Mingyi refers to more or less public opinion, and Mingxing approximately refers to the hearts and minds of the people. These twin concepts were first put forward by Mencius in the 3rd century BC, but highly relevant for today's internet age. Public opinions can be fleeting and change by hours with today's social media. Yet Mingxing, or the hearts and minds of people, are mostly stable and lasting. So despite the rise of populism in China, like elsewhere with the internet age, the Chinese state has on the whole practiced rule by Mingxing, thus allowing the country to better overcome short-termism so prevalent in the West, and is also able to plan for the long term, and even for the next generation. It follows that as far as democracy is concerned, the Chinese approach starts with what we call the Dao, or the overall purpose, objectives of democracy. In the context of Chinese culture, it will be about good governance. And then the Shu, which means specific procedures, measures, etc. So Chinese believe that the ultimate test of a good political system is not procedural democracy, but to what extent it can ensure the objective democracy, that is good governance. So I advocate all along, since many, many years ago, a paradigm shift from the outdated Cold War-like paradigm of so-called democracy versus autocracy to good governance versus bad governance. We should encourage different political models to compete with each other to see which model delivers good governance as judged by their peoples. Indeed, by international standards, I would say the American model of democracy, is in multiple crises. I remember Madame Pelosi, the US House Speaker, described the right, from our point of view, in Hong Kong in 2019 as a beautiful sight to behold. Yet amazingly, this beautiful sight soon reached the Capitol Hill, reached her office on 6 January last year. I remember a tweet went viral across the world, including China. If the United States saw what's happening on Capitol Hill, the US would invade the United States to liberate the United States from the tyranny of the United States. Another tweet also went viral did the first coup d'etat that happened in Americas without the participation of the US embassy. Indeed, this is how most non-Western countries view American democracy today. If we adopt, say, the criteria of Abraham Lincoln, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, as a measurement of democracy or good governance, I would say that virtually all leading credible international opinion surveys tend to review and suggest China has done better than the United States. For instance, Democracy Perception Index 2020, conducted by Dahlia Research based in Germany, 87% Chinese believe their government works for majority, while only 48% Americans think so for their country, and 52% Americans surveyed believe their government serves a minority. China became the world's largest economy by purchasing power parity in 2014, with the world's largest middle class of 400 million people, real middle class by Western standards, if not higher, larger than the US population. And China today has a life expectancy higher than the United States, than the American, 77.9 years old for China and 77 for the United States for the year 2021, due to the two countries' different approaches to fighting the COVID. China's official data shows that 90% of China's civil servants come from ordinary family background, while Nobel laureate Professor Stiglitz, my great friend, describes US as a country of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. And the latest PEW survey found that 72 Americans don't think the US is a good model of democracy for others. That's also unprecedented. The list goes on. As I told Professor Fukuyama 11 years ago in a much publicized debate you also mentioned early on in Shanghai, he said China needs political reform to embrace multi-party system. And I said that both China and the United States need political reform. But personally, I think the United States need more political reform, as US system, political system, is a product of pre-industrial era. Without substantial political reform, I predicted 11 years ago, the US may produce a leader worse off than George W. Bush. It turned out to be true for many. And I wish to repeat this forecast again here for the coming US election or elections, so long as the country is unable to conduct meaningful political reforms. It will be deep trouble. Again, this broad background of the rise of China as a civilizational state, and with the unfolding Ukraine crisis in view, the world seems increasingly divided. For example, over this sanction on Russia. The Western countries and its allies support sanctions, and the non-Western world don't support. As Italian ex-Prime Minister Berlusconi rightly put it, Russia is isolated by the West, and the West is isolated by the rest. And what's more important, many non-Western countries today also claim themselves to be civilizational state. Russia, Iran, India, Turkey, etc., all claim themselves today as civilizational state. Of course, one may argue over their definition of civilizational state, yet there is apparently a shared common theme in their public assertion and statements. They are somehow fed up with the Western meddling in their internal affairs and the Western condescending lecturing. And their message to the West is very simple: we are unique civilization, please show your respect and mind your own business. Now, before concluding, I will touch upon another aspect of civilizational state, which is directly related to the future of Hong Kong. If one looks at the Eurasian continent, one sees easily many what I call interfaces between civilization on this vast continent, stretching from Kiev to Istanbul, to Singapore, to Hong Kong, and to Shanghai. these metropolises are in many ways also civilizational in the sense that they constitute interactive and transaction nodes between East and West, between civilizations, between diverse cultures, and their checkered history, the ups and downs they experienced, shows that these transaction nodes operate either as a bridge between civilizations, between East and West, between diverse cultures, or as a contested outpost driven by clash of civilization and cultures, with one attempting to domineering over the other. Hong Kong should, of course, be a bridge, not contested outpost between civilizations. This also reminds me of the tragic fate of Ukraine today. Back in 2014, when the West supported color revolution sweeping Kiev, with the US government insisting that Ukraine had a full sovereign right to join NATO, Henry Kissinger, former US Secretary of State, counseled Kiev that if Ukraine is to survive and thrive, it should not join NATO, and that it must not be either side's outpost against the other. Rather, it should function as a bridge between them. In retrospect, I think Kissinger's counsel is more sensible for America's own interest, for European interest, and for Ukrainian interest. Indeed, history and geography dictate in many ways the fate of interactive nodes between civilizations. From Chinese point of view, you may wish to disagree. The national security law for Hong Kong, promulgated by the Chinese National People's Congress in 2020, is a decisive step to have saved Hong Kong from the tragic fate of Kiev. By the way, it's also reported at the high time of Hong Kong crisis in 2019, the Ukrainian neo-Nazi Azov Battalion sent its veterans to Hong Kong as expression of solidarity. I should be very candid here. In the eyes of the most Chinese, I repeat, the most Chinese, 90% if not more, the West has already made a mess of Iraq, made a mess of Afghanistan, made a mess of Libya, made a mess of Syria, and now Ukraine. So millions of lives lost, tens of millions homeless. China will never allow these tragedies to happen in Hong Kong or in Xinjiang or elsewhere in China. Only a civilizational state can allow for one country, two systems. But this diversity in harmony is based on mutual respect. If one side tries to take down the other side through an act of color revolution, this act will have to be brought to justice according to law. In the context of civilizational politics, the West has for too long and is still pursuing a strategy of divide and rule since the colonial times. In contrast, China pursues and prefers just the opposite, what I call unite and prosper, which China believes represents the best interests of most peoples. And not long ago, I met an old friend, former Pakistani ambassador to China. He told me that he toured the United States 2 years ago to give lectures on China. He was constantly asked a question, what's the future of China? And his reply was always very simple. His reply was, China is the future. I share his view. And the ideas I have outlined just now from a civilizational state perspective, which you may agree or disagree, such as meritocracy, good governance, prioritizing people's livelihood, balance of Ming-Yi and Ming-Xing, balance of Dao and Shu, and interface between civilizations are all very crucial for China's successful rise over the past decades, and for Hong Kong's prosperity, I think, as well. So at this critical moment of history, I hope these ideas will be relevant and even inspiring to many others, including those in the West, including those among the audience, as well as those in Hong Kong, when reflecting on this future of democracy and future of Hong Kong. Indeed, China has learned so much from the West and will continue to do so for its own benefit, we are from a culture of learning from others. It may be time and now for the West. I would use Deng Xiaoping's famous phrase, to emancipate the mind, to learn more about or even from some of the Chinese approaches and Chinese ideas, however extraneous they may appear, for their own benefit. This is not only to avoid a possible collision between the West and this hugely important nation, a civilization by itself, but also to enrich the world's collective wisdom in tackling all the challenges and crises facing mankind. Well, I think I will stop here.
Thank you.
And many thanks again for your presence. And I'll be more than happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, it's question singular at fcchk.org. Question at fcchk.org. I will start with a question, Weiwei, if you will, because you're a professor, like all good professors. I teach at HKU. We like to be challenged. We like to be challenged by our students. So I'm going to challenge you now. Please. Why is it that you think one party in China, it's the Communist Party? How can one party have all the answers? Because in the Western system, you have different parties that have different solutions to problems. And they debate and they discuss and they debate. And sometimes the winning party will adopt some ideas that came from the losing party. In the system that you're describing here, you're trying to tell me that one party has all the answers. Is that correct?
As I explained in my short presentation on civilizational state, actually, if you have to apply this concept of one party or one party system, then I can tell you, China has been on the one-party system for over 2,000 years, unified ruling entity since 221 BC. And this system was buttressed by a system of meritocracy, starting from Keji and then selection plus election. So within the Chinese Communist Party, I give you an example, this huge change from the Cultural Revolution to Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up. This huge change, which is perhaps larger in scale than the policy differences between Republican Party and Democratic Party. This huge change has been managed within one party structure, within the Communist Party China. In other words, there's intra-party democracy. People debated repeatedly on many issues, that they reach consensus. The point is you have the idea of partisan interest parties and holistic interest party. So that's key difference. In the case of China, you can't think of the partisan interest party. Then China will be, as we practiced after 1911 Republican Revolution, you have at least 1,000 political parties, and Washington will only support one of them, and China will be in chaos.
Let's continue on this. For example, Please. Let me give you one current example. The zero COVID policy. There are a lot of people, the World Health Organization said this is untenable. There are a lot of people within Shanghai, where you are, who are said, this is crazy, this is stupid. How do you know that because one person, the president of China, said we're sticking with zero COVID, how do you know that's the best policy? Can people challenge that policy within the system?
No, as you have said, there are quite a lot of vocal voices against this policy, as you have read already in Shanghai, for instance. Yet, you have to know, most Chinese support that policy.
How do you know that? How do you know most Chinese support that policy? How do you know that?
You have all kinds of surveys. And I can show you later on. No problem about this, because it's so factual. Let's look at you may say the case of Shanghai. Yes, Shanghai endured 2 months of inconvenience. Then it's over. So we knew early on, the model works, because at least a dozen Chinese cities, from Wuhan to Shenzhen to Guangzhou to Hefei, to Tianjin, they've all tried out and successfully. The point is that Shanghai, for some reason, should have started much earlier because the COVID occurred roughly at the same time with Shenzhen. Shenzhen in early March began this lockdown. In 10 days, it's over. Shanghai, 2 weeks behind the Shenzhen, then it became already quite a bigger problem. We could have started much earlier. So this is a proven tactic and policy, it works. So we always say in the case of civilizational state, for such large country, you have on the first hand, political, strategic certainty. No doubt about it, the model has worked and will work, at least up to now. Of course, Chinese model is also keeping with the changing time. For instance, from today, we used to be 7 days plus 7 days. Now it's 7 days.
But
So
excuse me, but I'm hearing a lot of people from Shanghai and other places saying there's a new theory going on called run shui, which means get out of China, run shui, they call it. They're saying they're sick of zero COVID.
No. No, if you look at all the indications, capital keeps on flowing and Chinese renminbi is appreciation. So don't worry about this. China have as Deng Xiaoping said, when before 25 years ago, at that time, the British media said, people are leaving Hong Kong, deserting Hong Kong. And Deng said, don't worry about this. So as our policies are good, more people will come, more capital will come. We are very open. If you want to migrate, actually, if you look at figures, both for students going abroad, for ex-immigration abroad, both going down, way down. So most people have confidence, even in Shanghai. You compare Shanghai with Hong Kong, for instance. Hong Kong has lost how many lives? Close to 10,000. Shanghai, 500. If you compare Shanghai with New York lost how many lives? 70,000.
At what price? At what price? People were starving. People were starving in Shanghai.
No, starving only minority for a few days, 1 or 2 days, then it's over. We know Shanghai, China has abundant supply. Don't worry about this.
Shanghai lockdown was a disaster.
No. This nonsense, That's a problem. I was watching mainstream Western media. You are so, as a civilizational state, we emphasize strategy and tactics.
So you think Shanghai lockdown was a success? You think it was a success?
It's a great success. Shanghai should have done better, but it's regrettable. But compared with the cost of New York and Hong Kong, it's much better.
So you think Shanghai lockdown? You think Shanghai lockdown was a success? Is that correct? They were killing people's dogs.
Per se.
They were killing dogs. People had no food to eat.
Less good than other models in Shanghai. Shenzhen model, Hefei model, Guangzhou model, Tianjin model, they've all done better. Shanghai should learn from them. But even with that, Shanghai model is much, much better than the New York model, Hong Kong model.
We're not talking about New York. We're not talking about Hong Kong. We're talking about Shanghai. You saying Shanghai was a success?
How many lives lost? No, 10,000. Hong Kong's population is 1/4 of Shanghai's. In the case of Shanghai, about 40,000 lives lost. Would Shanghai bear this? No
so you think
way.
Shanghai was a success? The lockdown was
Shanghai is not very successful. They showed you real trouble, which is regrettable. But most people appreciate that. We love that. Why I call China a super modern state? Because in the 21st century, you have the balance between individual freedom and responsibility. Otherwise, you cannot cope with this kind of unexpected disaster.
So freedom means nothing. It's all about zero
this
COVID.
Is freedom. Freedom and responsibility should be balanced. Liberalism cannot go too far. Extreme liberalism will bear with it huge cost. 1 million lives lost in the United States, 2 million lives in Europe. No, that model cannot work. I also tell you the basic fact, if you check Chinese social media, I can tell you briefly, the American model began to lose its luster, say, mainly in the year 2020. Yeah, because of COVID, and people thought, whoa, this is a disastrous model.
Okay.
So this is the problem. So for the young generation, no. I remember in December last year, I was asked by Western reporters, what would you think of this democracy summit to be held in by Biden? I said it will be a huge source of fun for Chinese young generation. People think, I'm sorry, you may dislike Donald Trump said, it's like a joke. No. We'll be too harsh on the United States. But to be all fairness, you have to improve yourself. We have our share problem. But on the China model, it has worked very well. Yeah.
In the US now, people are going out to baseball games now. They're going back to Broadway. They're going out to dinner. They're going to theaters. You're still tracking every case in Shanghai, in Beijing, in cities. You get 200 cases and you lock down the city. Is that how long can you have to have
this? China, a huge country. It's the size of about 100.
So why are you still treating? Why are you still treating COVID like it's Ebola? It doesn't kill you.
No. It's totally different. You have to look at the science. You are from the generation of the inspired by Enlightenment. Now China has done this better. Believe in science, believe in reasoning. No one knows exactly what will be sequelae after this. Many possible problems. Now new variants are coming. Look at the figure from Beijing. At the worst time of Beijing over the past few days, Beijing locked less than 1% of the population, less than 200,000. Same with Shanghai, with this dynamic clear.
At what price? At what price?
No, this price is reasonable. It's affordable. Otherwise, the whole country is lost. Yeah. In the case of China, if we copy the American model, it will be 4.5 million lives lost. The Chinese government will lose the mandate of heaven.
So you're saying, what is that? Because the healthcare system cannot cope with COVID, or is it because the vaccines don't work?
Because in the United States, in your country, in the Western countries, you only mainly rely on what I call the medical solution, vaccination and hospitalization, etc.
Isn't that the solution to COVID? Isn't that the solution to COVID?
No, we not only have this medical solution, we also have what we call societal protection, which you don't have that much. We have the neighborhood groups, we have the Chinese-style NGOs, we have the party institutions. So with this, you will see the Chinese Communist Party is not only a political institution, it's also a great social institution with grassroots party members volunteer to work without any pay and then for the benefit of the whole country. You don't have that. So you lose a lot of life. It's a pity, regrettable. Your human rights is deeply in trouble, Don't you agree?
So you think that Shanghai was a success? Is that correct?
If you look at Shanghai, over the past close to 3 years, 2 years and 7 months, Shanghai is only in lockdown inconvenience for 2 months. Only.
2 months. People were locked in their apartments for 2 months.
2 months.
They couldn't get food.
But
they could not get food.
You protected your neighborhood, your family.
They could not get
other
food.
cities in Shanghai, other peoples in China. It's a great contribution,
People could not get food for 2 months. They were
killing
people's
This is
pets.
nonsense. No. As a famous journalist, you cannot make this kind of huge mistake.
I watch social media in China. I talk to friends in Shanghai.
Tens of millions of ordinary Shanghai residents. How can we win this victory?
So you think they were happy? Shanghai people were happy. You think
today we are very happy. We are very proud.
Shanghai people were happy.
We made the sacrifices, but we made our contribution to Shanghai, to China. This is very important.
Okay. All right.
Remember
let me ask you.
We have a balance between freedom and responsibility.
Okay. Let me switch.
Proud of this tradition.
Let me switch topics here and ask some questions that have come in here. Some people have said, you talk about China as a civilizational state. Americans talk about American exceptionalism. Isn't that kind of the same thing? Americans say that America is exceptional. We're between these two oceans. You like to say that China is exceptional because it's a civilizational state. It's been a long civilization. What's the difference? Isn't every country exceptional?
The difference is, exceptionalism, because of American exceptionalism, this very term, exceptionalism, has a negative connotation. So I would use Chinese uniqueness versus American exceptionalism. What's the difference? This American exceptionalism is based on a kind of what I call imperial mindset. We can do whatever we want, export democracy, start wars here and there. This is really, I remember Jimmy Carter said to Donald Trump, he said, of the past 242 years, United States was in perpetual war, except 16 years. That's why China is surpassing us. So he was giving a lesson to Donald Trump, which will focus on development rather than wars. Now, as a result, I think US exceptionalism now is dangerous to the United States. For Chinese, for many non-Americans, really, the United States now is somehow a country, how should I say it? Unreal and surreal. You cannot solve problems, with the gun violence, now the issue of abortion and the infrastructure, whatever the drug problems, you cannot solve them, Why so? For people outside China, for Chinese, it's not that difficult. The Chinese solution, China unique is it's problem-oriented. You identify problem, whether it's COVID, whether it's the income difference, whether it's the climate change. We fix these problems one by one, So China is a country, some people say, governed by many engineers, problem-oriented, you find the solutions, and the problem will be over, next few months or next year. But the United States, see, medical insurance for all, it takes more than 1 century, still there, not yet resolved. Gun violence, next 100 years, do you think it can be resolved? It's surreal for other peoples. Behind this Chinese state is from a civilizational tradition, which we prioritize people's livelihood. You have to handle this. You do the surveys all the time. What are the major concerns of the people? Say income gap, pension, medical insurance, and you try to fix these problems one by one. And then the China model has worked.
So you believe the one-party state works, correct?
So this Chinese holistic interest party is a great success. Okay. By the way, this is common sense.
Okay.
In China, if you think, you have to know the Chinese Communist Party is an overwhelmingly positive force for China, for most Chinese. This is common sense. Without this understanding, you cannot understand modern China.
Okay, well, let me ask you a question. I was in China. Please. I was in China in 2012, and at a press conference, I asked the then Prime Minister Wen Jiabao, when will China have democratic elections? And he said, we're moving in that direction. He told me in a press conference. He said, we will first have elections for villages, then we will have elections for communes, and we'll have elections for towns. But he said, we are moving in the direction of letting people vote, but we have to vote slowly. Yeah. Now you're saying that actually democracy doesn't really matter. The one party knows everything. We don't really need democratic elections. No. Are you right, or was Wen Jiabao right?
No, in fact, in the 1980s and even 1990s, not only Wen Jiabao, but many other Chinese leaders think that way. And that's why we started experiment in grassroots, at the village level, one person, one vote. Yeah.
Right.
But we tried out this for about 20 and more years.
And what happened?
The end result is not very successful. You
Why
have
not?
all kinds of problems, as we saw in Taiwan. It's low quality democracy.
What's wrong with Taiwan?
Low.
What's wrong with Taiwan's democracy?
Too low,
What's wrong with Taiwan? Wait. What's wrong with Taiwan's democracy? What's wrong with Taiwan's democracy?
No. The point is, we find out from village level election, the result is not that good because of the money and what's called the family connections. All kinds of mafia politics emerged. That's why I coined the phrase selection plus election. Selection first, not election first. Because
so it's election with no choice.
No, election has choices. Election, even like when I say election, it means a broad term. It could mean, all kinds of opinion surveys, all kinds of, other way to know the person, and then as a way. There are a lot of you have to really appreciate what kind of experiment China has done, all kinds of experiments in different parts of China. But now we are far more sophisticated. We think we'll find a better way, at least for China. No longer the old approach, one person, one vote from village
So-
and to county and to high level.
So what
I don't
happened?
think that's the main dominant thing.
So what
We
happened to
have
the?
a selection plus election. That's a much better system. Yeah.
So what happened to the idea of having village elections and town elections and?
They are still there, still there. But now with more structured elections, a very strict rule. Number one is no money should be involved. So this should be something educational to American politics. No money involved. This campaign contribution should all be stopped. But now you have no ceiling for campaign contribution. Deeply miserable.
I agree with that. I agree with that. Well, so let me move on to another issue. You were the interpreter for Deng Xiaoping. And so you must know what he was thinking or what was on his mind when he talked about one country, two systems. Here in Hong Kong, we're at the 25th anniversary of we're halfway through the promised 50 years of autonomy and preservation of personal freedoms. What do you think Deng Xiaoping would think now if he looked at Hong Kong?
Well, Deng Xiaoping himself was in Hong Kong several times in the very early on. He was first in Hong Kong in the year 1920 when he was on his way to France to have this study work program. And then he was a guerrilla fighter organizing uprisings in Guangxi, and he went back to Shanghai via Hong Kong many times. So a lot of memory of Hong Kong, and he missed Hong Kong a lot. He once said, I wish I could live to that particular date, 1st July, 1997. In retrospect, I would say, if you look at Deng Xiaoping's character and his overall thinking on Hong Kong, you may remember in 1983, 83, one Chinese leader said, we don't need to station our troops in Hong Kong. And Deng said, this is nonsense. He said it to Hong Kong reporters. And I'll tell you another story you may not know. In 1992, when the People's Liberation Army presented him with a report on Chinese military preparation for the handover, etc. Then he said with two Chinese words, too soft, not hard enough. And basically he said, very bluntly, he said, this is military preparation for a peaceful transfer. What about, let me be very frank, not exactly his words, but the idea is accurate. If the British did something unexpected, so there will be no particular peaceful transfer on that particular day, are you militarily prepared for a non-peaceful transfer? So the PRA redrafted the transfer. So I would say if Deng Xiaoping has lived till today, perhaps this national security law for Hong Kong could have been applied much earlier or something similar. Because he's very blunt and straightforward. I remember when I was his interpreter, he kept on talking about China model. This is China model, this is China model. So I don't know why, after some years after this, we don't talk about China model. I'm one of very few scholars who insist we should talk about China model. This is about self-confidence. Of course, this model is not perfect. We have our share problem, but it's working. It's working better than many other models.
Sure. We have a couple questions coming in. I want to get to you. One is from, I hope I pronounced the name correctly, Anouk Agaram, from China correspondent for the Dutch Financial Daily, who's asking basically what kind of, basically since Hong Kong is under control of the mainland, what do you expect between now and 2047, basically the next 25 years, because we had this kind of 50-year, what do you expect?
I expect that, Hong Kong and the Chinese mainland will be engaged in more interactions. Hong Kong practice capitalist system, which China agrees, no problem, you can do that because Hong Kong is a small part of China. that will not affect Chinese socialism. Yet the problem with Hong Kong's capitalism, as we can see with Hong Kong's current economic structure, it's primarily financial sector and the real estate sector. This kind of structure has been there for so many decades. From Chinese point of view and with the China model, we think we should improve the economic structure. You know, to be very frank, I've been to Hong Kong many times. You know, in Chinese, we say first tier cities, second tier cities, third and fourth. Even in China's fourth tier cities, people's housing conditions are better than Hong Kong's. Although Hong Kong's per capita GDP is way above many Chinese cities. So this is something Hong Kong should reflect upon. So I think Hong Kong needs to improve its economic structure. Ideally, we should have more mutual learning. Chinese mainland has learned a lot from Hong Kong. For instance, Shanghai has learned from Hong Kong about this land lease and land sale. You know, more or less we learn selectively from the Hong Kong model. So Hong Kong could also learn next door in Shenzhen how they, you know, boost this first rate, you know, 5G technology with Huawei there. And I was reading about this Great Bay Initiative and also the initiative of new center of development close to Shenzhen. All these are good ideas because with the capitalist system, you don't have a communist party, holistic interest party. So you cannot overcome a lot of vested interests. So what you need is something additional, more or less like the Chinese approach to reform. We met resistance, we create a new center of growth. You know, then gradually we tackle the existing problems. So the new center of growth is important, whether it's high-tech cooperation with the Chinese mainland and also new urban centers close to Shenzhen, etc.
Okay, Weiwei, we got a couple of questions coming in, a lot on COVID. Mr. H. Lee added, he sends a question saying, look, he said, Professor Zhang did not count the deaths in Shanghai, I guess, and elsewhere, caused by secondary causes, such as old men left alone in apartments to die. People refuse hospital treatment for COVID or other disease or for other diseases. You're only counting direct deaths from COVID. And actually, most Americans did not die of COVID over the past 2 years directly. They died of other things. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, basically, this death toll for any country, United States, China, or India, eventually for Hong Kong, what I use is the figures from WHO. They use this what's called the extra deaths. In normal year, total death should be roughly same.
Exactly.
Yeah. But now there's 1 million more deaths for the United States, so that's COVID. In India, it's even more. It's 4 million. India is not happy about this, but anyway, that's extra deaths. So that will be fair comparison. No, there are all kinds of problems you mentioned. Perhaps there are even more cases. Eventually, we'll have a balance sheet. But so far, I can assure you, because I live in Shanghai, in the city, I can tell you with certainty, most people here in Shanghai appreciate this overall strategy. You know, the Chinese approach always divided into strategy and tactics. If strategy is correct, all the tactical mistakes can be addressed one by one. But if strategy is wrong, then the cost, human cost, economic cost will be immense, will be unbearable. Yeah.
Okay, and a follow-up question, same questioner, Mr. Lee asked, when do you expect China's zero COVID policy will be lifted?
No, this is not a great translation, you know. Actually, which official translation is dynamic clearance. For instance, in Shanghai, Beijing, you know, today it's no case. Yesterday there is 2 cases. So this is called the dynamic clearance. Then we block one building, you know, less than 1 out of 1,000 people in Shanghai was affected. Far less than that. 1 out of, I don't know, 500,000. So it depends. With today's situation, we can afford this dynamic clearance because the total disease is well under control. Yeah. at the time of March and April, Shanghai could not afford this because you have, in the end, over 600,000 cases, affected.
Okay.
So
And
now it's relatively easy.
thank you. And then Julian Lim asked, if the government in China believes it has the support of the population, why does it seem so afraid of deaths caused by COVID, and instead of unrest, social unrest, especially if such losses are occurring when every other countries are having much more losses? They seem to be more.
No,
the question says they seem more concerned about social unrest than about deaths.
We are just really, puzzled. We know. I hope this particular individual who raised the question is also from maybe the West. The West is always lecturing China on human rights. From Chinese point of view, basic human rights, human life. You protect life. Even this right to abortion is about life, in the name of life, But then you don't care about the gun control. How Chinese are puzzled by this. That's why I said unreal and surreal. 1 million lives lost. People don't care about it. Nothing, I just feel we don't want this kind of political system. If you want, you stay with that system. Well protected, looked after by the Chinese state. People appreciate that. People are grateful to that. Really, So afterwards, the civilizational state, the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese state is responsible for the continuation of this civilization. That's important. You can't have a system which causes a sharp death toll. Almost 2 years lost for American lives. As a result, the life expectancy in the United States is shorter than China's. This is, for the Americans, this is a shame. For Chinese, we think we have done really much, much better.
And we've only got about 2 minutes left. One quick question. How would Professor Zhang expect China to be able to solve the aging and the shrinking population in China? What should be done?
Well, indeed, there is a decline of a birth rate, but this is also, this coincides with the rise of AI and other new technologies. By the way, China is at the forefront of the cutting edge of these new technologies on the par with the United States. So in other words, this decline of birth rate and the population will be somehow, coped with the better and new technologies. At least that's be one solution. And furthermore, the Chinese civilization has gone through many ups and downs. And let's worry about this. We think there will be a lot of, for instance, now today, this is what we call the gray hair industry. It's a new industry. It's going up. There are always ways, not just problems, but also solutions, more solutions to problems than problems. Warm optimist.
Professor Zhang Weiwei, thank you for coming in the Lion's Den and taking some tough questions.
Thank you.
We love it. We appreciate it. I'm going to ask you one last easy question. We ask all of our guests. Please tell me, what are you reading these days, or what can you recommend our FCC members listening here read?
I was reading actually a book called The Rise of Civilizational State, and by Professor Cooker, because I put forward this idea, phrase civilizational state. Other scientific civilization states, they are used interchangeably. And so this civilization state and civilizational state are now part of the mainstream political narratives in international politics. So I was following this a bit to see what's the outside the West discussion on this very concept. My sense is some liberal intellectuals are deeply worried about this rise of civilizational state. I think they should be less worried, because with the rise of the non-Western world, that the West can learn a lot from other countries, other cultures, other civilizations. We have learned a lot, as I said, from the West. Why not the West cannot learn something from us?
We can learn a lot from each other. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. I think so.
Professor Zhang Weiwei, Distinguished Professor of International Relations, Director of the China Institute at Fudan University in one of my favorite towns, Shanghai. Thank you so much for coming in. Thank you for taking our tough questions and
thank you.
Hurrying back and forth. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. We enjoyed it. I think the audience enjoyed it.
Enjoyed it.
And please come back. We really enjoyed it. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much.
FCC. Please keep an eye on fcchk.org for our upcoming events. And we'll see you all later, either here in person at the club, because we're now back for live events, or in the Zoom space. Again, thank you, Professor Zhang.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you all. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.